What happens when a single piece of ink on someone's skin becomes the key to unlocking one of the most shocking cases of stolen valor in military history? When Sarah Mitchell was handcuffed in a downtown coffee shop, accused of impersonating a Navy SEAL, everyone thought they had caught another fraud red-handed. The military police were certain. The evidence seemed clear. Her story sounded impossible. But sometimes, the most unbelievable stories turn out to be the most true. This is the story of how a woman's arrest for stolen valor became a revelation that would shake the very foundations of military secrecy, expose a decades-long cover-up, and prove that some missions are so classified that even the people who carried them out were erased from history. It's about a tattoo that held more secrets than anyone imagined, an admiral who recognized something others missed, and the moment when fiction became fact in the most extraordinary way possible. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about military service, classified operations, and the women who have served in shadows so deep that their very existence was denied. This isn't just a story about mistaken identity. It's about the price of silence, the weight of secrets, and what happens when the truth finally fights its way to the surface. The arrest was just the beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy downtown street as Sarah Mitchell sat in her favorite corner booth at Brewster's coffee shop, laptop open, steam rising from her untouched cup of black coffee. She had chosen this spot deliberately, with clear sight lines to both entrances and her back to the wall. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits had once meant the difference between life and death in places most people couldn't pronounce. At 38, Sarah carried herself with a quiet confidence that most observers mistook for simple self-assurance. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the kind of understated clothing that allowed her to blend into any crowd. What people didn't notice was how her eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging faces, noting exits, assessing threats that probably didn't exist. What they definitely didn't see was the intricate tattoo hidden beneath her long-sleeved shirt, a piece of artwork so detailed and specific that it would soon become the center of a controversy that would change her life forever. Sarah had been living quietly in Portland, Oregon, for the past 3 years, working as a freelance security consultant for small businesses. It was honest work that paid the bills and allowed her to use skills she'd acquired during what she told people was time in the military. She never elaborated, and most people didn't push. Veterans often carried invisible wounds, and Sarah's reluctance to discuss her service seemed entirely normal to those around her. But normal was about to become a luxury Sarah could no longer afford. The trouble started with Marcus Webb, a 24-year-old barista at Brewster's who had recently graduated from Portland State with a degree in journalism. Marcus was ambitious, eager to make his mark, and convinced that every person who walked through the coffee shop's doors was potentially harboring a story worth telling. He had noticed Sarah months ago, intrigued by her disciplined routine and the way she carried herself. When he finally worked up the courage to strike up a conversation, he was immediately drawn to her quiet intelligence and the hints of experiences that seemed far beyond anything he'd encountered in his sheltered academic life. Over several weeks, their casual conversations gradually became more personal. Marcus found himself sharing his dreams of investigative journalism, while Sarah, perhaps feeling isolated after years of enforced solitude, began to open up about her past. She spoke carefully, revealing just enough to satisfy curiosity without compromising what she believed were still active security protocols. She mentioned training that had been more intense than most people could imagine, deployments to places that don't officially exist on any map, and missions that were classified at levels most people never hear about. Marcus, with the enthusiasm of youth and the ambition of someone convinced he was destined for greatness, interpreted these carefully worded revelations as something far more specific. In his mind, Sarah's hints about specialized training, her obvious physical fitness, and her reluctance to discuss details could only mean one thing. She was a Navy SEAL. It was an exciting possibility, especially since everyone knew that women weren't allowed in SEAL teams. This could be the story that launched his career. What Marcus didn't understand was the vast difference between interpretation and truth. What Sarah didn't realize was how dangerous it could be when someone else's assumptions began to take on a life of their own. The situation escalated when Marcus, unable to contain his excitement about his perceived discovery, began sharing his theory with friends. Within days, rumors were circulating through his social circle about the female Navy SEAL who worked at the local coffee shop. The story grew with each telling, as stories do, gaining details that Marcus had never mentioned and certainty that he had never claimed. By the time the rumors reached Jake Sullivan, a 20-year Navy veteran who now worked as a contractor for the Department of Defense, they had transformed into flat-out claims that Sarah Mitchell was publicly claiming to have been a Navy SEAL. Jake, who had genuine respect for the SEAL community and a deep hatred for those who falsely claimed military honors they hadn't earned, decided to investigate. Jake's investigation was thorough, methodical, and based on records that he had legitimate access to through his government contracting work. He searched personnel databases, deployment records, and training rosters. He cross-referenced dates and locations. He contacted sources within the special operations community. Every search came back negative. There was no record of any Sarah Mitchell having served in any Navy SEAL capacity. There was no record of women having been integrated into SEAL teams during the time frame when Sarah would have been active. More damningly, there was no record of Sarah Mitchell having served in the Navy at all. Armed with what he considered irrefutable evidence of stolen valor, Jake contacted the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. NCIS, always eager to pursue cases of military impersonation, launched their own investigation. They assigned Agent Patricia Reeves, a former Marine who had made a career of investigating fraud cases, to build a case against Sarah Mitchell. Agent Reeves approached the investigation with the methodical precision that had made her successful. She interviewed Marcus Webb, who by this point was beginning to realize that his assumptions might have created a serious problem for someone he genuinely liked. She spoke with the friends who had spread the rumors, documenting how the story had evolved and spread. She conducted surveillance of Sarah's daily routine, photographed her interactions, and built what she believed was a solid case. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Multiple witnesses claimed that Sarah had either directly stated or strongly implied that she was a former Navy SEAL. She had spoken knowledgeably about military operations and demonstrated familiarity with classified procedures. She had allowed others to believe she had served in special operations without correcting their assumptions. Most importantly, official records showed no evidence that Sarah Mitchell had ever served in any military capacity whatsoever. On a Thursday morning in March, Agent Reeves decided she had enough evidence to make an arrest. She coordinated with local Portland police to ensure that the arrest would go smoothly, and chose Brewster's coffee shop as the location, knowing that Sarah would be there during her regular morning routine. Sarah noticed the unusual activity before the agents reached her table. Her trained eye picked up the subtle signs of coordinated movement, the way multiple individuals positioned themselves to block exits, the body language that screamed law enforcement. By the time Agent Reeves approached her booth, Sarah had already assessed the situation and made the conscious decision not to run. Running would only make things worse, and she had done nothing wrong. Agent Reeves was professional but firm as she approached the table. She identified herself and stated that Sarah Mitchell was under arrest for violating federal laws regarding the unauthorized wearing, manufacturing, or sale of military decorations and medals, specifically relating to claims of Navy SEAL service. The formal charges would include violations of the Stolen Valor Act, a federal law that made it a crime to falsely claim military honors. Sarah's response surprised everyone present. Instead of denial, anger, or the panic that Agent Reeves had expected, Sarah simply nodded and said, "I understand. Before you put the handcuffs on, I need you to know that there are protocols that need to be followed. This situation is more complicated than you realize." Agent Reeves, who had heard every possible excuse and denial from previous suspects, interpreted Sarah's calm response as either sophisticated preparation or dangerous delusion. She proceeded with the arrest, reading Sarah her rights while the entire coffee shop watched in stunned silence. Marcus Webb, realizing that his casual conversations had somehow led to this moment, felt a sinking sensation in his stomach that would haunt him for weeks. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Sarah made one final request that would later prove to be crucial. "I need you to document everything carefully," she said quietly. "Especially anything you find that seems unusual. There are people who will want to know exactly what happened here today." The booking process at the Portland Police Bureau was routine until the moment when Sarah was asked to remove her shirt for the standard booking photograph. Agent Reeves, who was conducting the processing, was expecting to document any tattoos for identification purposes. What she found instead was something that would soon turn the entire investigation on its head. Covering most of Sarah's upper back was an intricate tattoo that immediately stood out as unlike anything Agent Reeves had seen before. The design was extraordinarily detailed, featuring symbols, coordinates, and imagery that seemed to tell a story. At the center was a trident, but it was surrounded by elements that didn't match standard Navy SEAL iconography. There were dates that didn't correspond to known operations, coordinates that pointed to locations that didn't appear on standard maps, and symbols that Agent Reeves didn't recognize, but that clearly held significance. Most striking was a series of numbers along the bottom of the tattoo that appeared to be some kind of code or identification sequence. Agent Reeves photographed everything carefully, following standard procedure, but something about the level of detail and apparent authenticity of the tattoo nagged at her. In her experience, people who falsely claimed military service usually got the details wrong. This tattoo looked like it had been created by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The processing continued, but Agent Reeves found herself returning to the photographs of Sarah's tattoo. The more she studied the images, the more convinced she became that there was something significant about what she was seeing. The tattoo wasn't just elaborate. It was precise in ways that suggested authentic knowledge rather than research or imagination. Sarah was held in a federal holding facility pending her initial court appearance, scheduled for the following Monday. The charges were serious enough to carry potential jail time and significant fines. The government's case seemed straightforward. Sarah Mitchell had falsely claimed military service that records proved she had never performed, and multiple witnesses could testify to her claims. But in a basement office at the Pentagon, a different kind of investigation was about to begin. The booking photographs and arrest report had been automatically flagged and forwarded to various military intelligence departments as part of standard procedure for cases involving claims of special operations service. Most of these reports were routinely filed and forgotten, but this one would soon capture the attention of someone who recognized what others had missed. Admiral Robert Chin was not someone who paid attention to routine stolen valor cases. As the Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, his concerns were far above the level of individual fraud cases. But on that Friday afternoon, a junior analyst named Lieutenant Jennifer Hayes brought him something that she thought he needed to see. Lieutenant Hayes specialized in analyzing patterns and anomalies in intelligence data, and something about the Sarah Mitchell case had caught her attention. The tattoo photographs had been enhanced and analyzed by the Intelligence Department's imaging specialists. What they found was remarkable. Hidden within the seemingly decorative elements of the tattoo were encoded references to operations that were still classified at the highest levels. The coordinates pointed to locations that were involved in missions that had never been publicly acknowledged. The dates corresponded to activities that were known only to a very small circle of intelligence operatives. Most significantly, the number sequence at the bottom of the tattoo matched a coding system that had been used for a highly classified program that had operated during a very specific time frame. Lieutenant Hayes had recognized the pattern because she had been researching historical intelligence operations for her master's thesis in military history before joining the Navy. Admiral Chun studied the photographs with growing amazement and concern. The level of detail and accuracy suggested that whoever had created this tattoo had access to information that was still classified decades later. This was either the most sophisticated stolen valor case in history, or something far more complex was happening. But it was what Admiral Chin noticed in the enhanced close-up of one section of the tattoo that changed everything. Hidden among the decorative elements, so subtle that it required enhancement to see clearly, was a small symbol that made the Admiral's blood run cold. It was a mark that identified participation in Operation Nightfall, a program so secret that Admiral Chun was one of only 12 people currently living who were supposed to know it had ever existed. The problem was that according to every official record, Operation Nightfall had never included any female operatives. Admiral Chun reached for his secure phone and began making calls that would soon turn Sarah Mitchell's arrest into something far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The hunt for truth was about to begin, and what they would discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about the history of women in special operations. The woman sitting in a holding cell in Portland, Oregon, was about to become the center of a revelation that would expose secrets that had been buried for decades. The tattoo that had seemed like evidence of fraud was actually proof of something far more extraordinary. The existence of operations so classified that even their participants had been erased from official history. Sarah Mitchell's arrest for stolen valor was about to become the key that unlocked one of the military's most closely guarded secrets. But first, they had to figure out who she really was, and why someone had gone to such extraordinary lengths to make sure her service was never officially recorded. Admiral Robert Chin hadn't slept more than 3 hours since seeing the photographs of Sarah Mitchell's tattoo. For 48 hours, he had been making phone calls to people who officially didn't exist, accessing files that were buried so deep in classified archives that retrieving them required authorization from the highest levels of government. What he was discovering was rewriting his understanding of military history. Operation Nightfall had been classified above top secret for good reason. Conceived in the late 1990s as a response to emerging global threats that required a different kind of military response, it had been designed to operate completely outside traditional military structures. The program had recruited operatives from various special forces units, put them through additional training that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible, and then deployed them on missions that could never be officially acknowledged. Admiral Chun had been a young lieutenant commander when Nightfall was operational, serving as a liaison between naval intelligence and the program's leadership. He had clearance to know that the program existed, but he had never had access to operational details or personnel records. What he knew was that Nightfall operatives had been involved in some of the most crucial and sensitive missions of the early 2000s, preventing terrorist attacks and conducting operations that had shaped world events in ways the public would never know. He also knew that Operation Nightfall had officially ended in 2008, and that all records of its activities had been sealed under a classification level that would keep them hidden for at least 50 years. The operatives had been debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and reassigned to other duties with their Nightfall service expunged from their official records. It was a necessary fiction to protect national security, but it meant that people who had served their country in extraordinary ways could never be officially recognized for their sacrifice. What Admiral Chun was discovering in the archived files, however, was that his understanding of Nightfall had been incomplete. The program had included a sub-operation called Shadow Rose that had been compartmentalized to such a degree that even other Nightfall personnel weren't aware of its existence. Shadow Rose had been an experimental program that tested whether female operatives could be integrated into the most demanding special operations missions. The files that Admiral Chun was now accessing, with authorization that came directly from the Secretary of Defense after a series of urgent secure communications, revealed that Shadow Rose had been far more successful than anyone had imagined. Between 2001 and 2007, 12 women had been recruited for the program, put through training that exceeded even Navy SEAL requirements, and deployed on missions that had been crucial to national security. The women of Shadow Rose had operated in environments where male operatives would have been immediately detected. They had infiltrated organizations, gathered intelligence, and conducted operations in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and several other countries that couldn't be named even in classified documents. They had saved lives, prevented attacks, and accomplished objectives that had shaped the course of military conflicts. But Shadow Rose had been terminated abruptly in 2007 following what the files described only as operational complications that required immediate program shutdown and participant extraction. The 12 women had been brought back to the United States, debriefed under the most stringent security protocols, and then something unprecedented had happened. Their service had been completely erased. Not just classified or hidden, but actually erased. New identities had been created for them. Their military records had been altered to show different service histories. Their families had been told they had been serving in traditional military roles. Even they had been instructed to never acknowledge their true service, under threat of federal prosecution for revealing classified information. Admiral Chin found records showing that the 12 Shadow Rose operatives had been given new lives, new stories, and new official histories. They had been told that their real service would always remain classified, and that they should consider their sacrifice a permanent one. They could never claim their true military honors, never tell their real stories, never seek recognition for what they had accomplished. As Admiral Chen read through the files, he found documentation of the unique identification system that had been used for Shadow Rose operatives. Each woman had been assigned a numerical code that was embedded in various ways into items they carried. For some, it was engraved into jewelry. For others, it was coded into documents they maintained. For at least 3 of them, according to the files, the codes had been incorporated into tattoos that also contained operational details that could serve as identification if other systems failed. The number sequence in Sarah Mitchell's tattoo matched the coding system perfectly. More specifically, it identified her as Rose 7, the 7th operative recruited into the Shadow Rose program. Admiral Chin found her file buried so deep in the classified archives that accessing it required additional authorization from intelligence officials who worked in offices that didn't officially exist. The woman the world knew as Sarah Mitchell had been born Rachel Elizabeth Thompson in Columbus, Ohio, in 1985. She had enlisted in the Army in 2003 at age 18, showing exceptional aptitude for languages, tactical thinking, and physical conditioning. After completing basic training and advanced individual training, she had been recommended for special operations selection by instructors who recognized her unique combination of intelligence, physical capability, and psychological resilience. Rachel had completed Army Ranger training with scores that placed her in the top 5% of all candidates. She had then been selected for additional specialized training that the records indicated had been beyond standard special operations parameters. By 2004, she had been recruited into Operation Nightfall, and by early 2005, she had been selected for the experimental Shadow Rose program. The training records made Admiral Chen's eyes water. Rachel Thompson had undergone 18 months of preparation that included advanced combat techniques, deep cover infiltration methods, psychological conditioning, language immersion in Arabic and Pashto, cultural assimilation training, and physical conditioning that surpassed anything required for traditional special forces. She had been trained to operate independently for extended periods in hostile territory, to gather intelligence through methods that required extraordinary personal risk, and to conduct operations that could never be officially acknowledged. Her deployment records showed service in Afghanistan and Iraq that had never appeared in any official military documentation. She had spent 3 years operating in deep cover, often completely cut off from support, conducting missions that had prevented terrorist attacks, and gathered intelligence that had shaped military strategy. The after-action reports described her performance as exceptional and crucial to mission success. But it was the circumstances of her extraction from Shadow Rose that explained why Sarah Mitchell had been living in quiet anonymity in Portland. In 2007, Rachel Thompson's cover had been compromised during an operation in a location that the files identified only as Target Zone 7. She had been captured, held for 6 days, and subjected to interrogation that the medical reports described in clinical terms that couldn't hide the brutality she had endured. Rachel had been rescued by a joint special operations team, but her captivity had compromised not just her own identity, but potentially the entire Shadow Rose program. The decision had been made to immediately terminate the program and extract all operatives. Rachel had been the last one brought out, and her experience had been the catalyst for the program's shutdown. The psychological evaluation conducted after her rescue showed someone who had been deeply traumatized but who had never broken under interrogation. She had protected the program's secrets even under extreme duress, but the experience had left her with injuries that went far beyond the physical. The recommendation had been for extensive rehabilitation and complete identity change. Rachel Thompson had officially died in a training accident in 2008. Sarah Mitchell had been created to give her a chance at a normal life, with a carefully constructed background that would allow her to disappear into civilian society. She had been given a partial disability pension under her new identity, access to medical care for injuries that were attributed to a vehicle accident during routine military service, and a promise that her sacrifice would always be remembered by those who mattered, even if it could never be publicly acknowledged. Admiral Chen found the final entry in Rachel Thompson's file, written by the program director in 2008. Rose 7 gave everything for her country and can never be thanked. She deserves peace. Her service will remain classified, but it will never be forgotten by those who know what she accomplished. She earned honors she can never claim and saved lives that will never know her name. The least we can do is let her disappear. Now, 23 years later, Sarah Mitchell's careful anonymity had been shattered by rumors and assumptions that had led to her arrest for stolen valor. She was sitting in a federal holding facility, accused of falsely claiming honors that she had actually earned but could never officially acknowledge. The irony was devastating, but the implications were far more serious. Admiral Chen realized that Sarah's arrest had created a security crisis that extended far beyond one woman's situation. If her case went to trial, defense attorneys would inevitably demand access to military records to verify or disprove the government's claims. Those investigations could potentially expose Operation Nightfall and Shadow Rose, revealing classified programs that were still considered vital to national security. The 12 women who had been given new lives could all be compromised. More immediately, Admiral Chen realized that Sarah Mitchell herself was in danger. The arrest had been public, photographed, and reported in local media as a stolen valor case. If anyone from her previous life as Rachel Thompson recognized her from those photos, people who still had reasons to want revenge against Shadow Rose operatives might realize that one of their targets was sitting in a holding cell in Portland, Oregon. Admiral Chun made a series of urgent phone calls that reached the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership. Within hours, a team was being assembled to handle what was being classified as a potential exposure of vital national security assets. The team included personnel from Naval Intelligence, Army Special Operations, the FBI, and several agencies that Admiral Chin wasn't authorized to identify. But time was working against them. Sarah Mitchell's court appearance was scheduled for Monday morning, less than 18 hours away. Her appointed federal public defender was already preparing a defense that would challenge the government's evidence and demand access to military records. Local media were already reporting the story as an example of stolen valor enforcement. Most critically, the photographs of her arrest were already spreading on social media, shared by people outraged by what they saw as disrespect for military service. Admiral Chin looked at the clock and realized they had less than a day to figure out how to resolve a situation that could expose some of the most classified operations in modern military history while protecting a woman who had already sacrificed more for her country than most people could imagine. The woman who had once been Rachel Thompson, who had survived 18 months of training that broke most candidates, who had spent 3 years operating in the most dangerous places on Earth, who had endured capture and torture without breaking, was about to face perhaps her greatest challenge yet, proving her innocence of crimes that she had never committed while protecting secrets that could never be revealed. Admiral Chen began making the calls that would determine whether justice could be served without compromising national security. The race against time had begun, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Sarah Mitchell's freedom, the safety of 11 other women, and the security of operations that were still protecting American lives all hung in the balance. In a holding cell in Portland, unaware that her true identity had been discovered, Sarah Mitchell sat quietly and waited. She had learned patience during 3 years of operations where waiting was often the difference between success and catastrophe. She had learned to trust that the right people would eventually understand the truth. She was about to find out if that trust had been misplaced. The emergency meeting convened at 0400 hours on Sunday morning in a secure conference room 3 levels below the Pentagon. The participants had been roused from their beds and told only that they were needed for a matter of highest national security priority. As they filed into the windowless room, each carrying coffee and the weight of interrupted sleep, none of them could have imagined the complexity of the situation they were about to confront. Admiral Robert Chin stood at the head of the conference table, surrounded by classified documents that told a story spanning 2 decades. Seated around the table were some of the most senior intelligence and military officials in the country. General Patricia Harrison from Army Special Operations Command, FBI Director James Morrison, NSA Deputy Director Sarah Kim, and several others whose names and titles were themselves classified information. Also present, via secure video conference, was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had served as the chief psychologist for Operation Nightfall, and who was now quietly living in retirement in Tucson, Arizona. Her presence was crucial because she was one of the few people still living who had direct knowledge of the Shadow Rose program and its participants. Admiral Chin began the briefing with a statement that silenced the room. "We have a situation that could potentially expose one of our most successful and most classified special operations programs, compromise the safety of 11 deep cover assets, and reveal military capabilities that remain crucial to ongoing national security operations. We have approximately 6 hours to resolve it before it becomes public in a federal courtroom." The story Admiral Chun told over the next hour was met with increasing amazement and concern. General Harrison, who had overseen special operations for the past decade, was stunned to learn about Shadow Rose. "You're telling me we had women operating at SEAL-level capability 15 years ago, and I've never heard of it." "That was the point," replied Dr. Warren from the video screen. Shadow Rose was compartmentalized to such a degree that knowledge of it was limited to fewer than 30 people at any given time. Even within Nightfall, most operatives didn't know about the female program. It was the most successful experiment in special operations integration we've ever conducted, and it had to remain completely hidden. FBI Director Morrison reviewed the arrest file and shook his head. "So we've arrested one of our own most classified operatives for impersonating herself? And if we try to prove she's lying about her service, we'll have to reveal that she's telling the truth about operations that are still classified above top secret?" The legal implications were staggering. Sarah Mitchell had been charged under the Stolen Valor Act, which required the government to prove that she had never performed the military service she was accused of claiming. But proving that Sarah Mitchell had never served would require revealing that Rachel Thompson had served in ways that exceeded any official Navy SEAL training or deployment. The defense would undoubtedly demand access to military records, and those investigations would inevitably lead to classified information that could compromise ongoing operations. NSA Deputy Director Kim raised another crucial concern. What about the other 11 Shadow Rose operatives? If this goes public, if their program gets exposed, what happens to their security? Dr. Warren's expression on the video screen grew grave. That's what terrifies me most about this situation. These women didn't just serve in classified operations. They made enemies. Personal enemies. People who tortured some of them, who lost family members or organizations to their missions. If their identities get exposed, if people realize that these women are living normal lives under assumed names, some of them could be targeted for revenge attacks. Admiral Chin pulled up a map showing the current locations of the 11 other former Shadow Rose operatives. They were scattered across the country, living quiet lives under identities that had been carefully constructed, but that could potentially be unraveled if investigators began looking into the program's history. A retired teacher in Minnesota, a small business owner in Texas, a nurse in Florida. Women who had served their country in extraordinary ways, and who were now vulnerable to exposure through no fault of their own. The time pressure was relentless. Sarah Mitchell's court appearance was scheduled for 0900 hours, less than 5 hours away. Her federal public defender, Michael Rodriguez, was a competent attorney who would undoubtedly challenge the government's case vigorously. He would demand evidence, request military records, and potentially expose classified information in open court. General Harrison asked the question everyone was thinking: what are our options here? The discussion that followed explored possibilities that ranged from practical to extraordinary. They could approach the prosecutor and request a sealed hearing where classified information could be presented to the judge without public disclosure. They could invoke national security privileges to prevent the trial from proceeding. They could attempt to convince Sarah to plead guilty to avoid a public trial, although that would require revealing to her that her true identity had been discovered. Dr. Warren raised a critical psychological concern. You have to understand what you're dealing with. Rachel Thompson, the woman you know as Sarah Mitchell, has been living with deep psychological trauma for 16 years. She's been told that her real service can never be acknowledged, that she has to live a lie for the rest of her life. Being arrested for stolen valor, being accused of falsely claiming honors that she actually earned at tremendous personal cost, this could be devastating to her mental health. Admiral Chun had been considering the most radical option, and he finally voiced it. What if we brought her in? What if we revealed to her that we know who she really is? And we asked for her help in resolving this situation. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. Contacting Sarah would mean breaking the compartmentalization that had protected the Shadow Rose program for 16 years. It would mean revealing to her that people in government still knew her real identity and her real service. It could provide a solution to the immediate crisis, but it would also change everything about her carefully constructed new life. FBI Director Morrison pointed out another complication. Even if we contact her, even if she agrees to cooperate, we still have to deal with the media attention, the witnesses who claim she made false statements, and the fact that this arrest is already public record. We can't just make this disappear without creating more questions. Dr. Warren offered a different perspective. You might be surprised by her reaction. These women were extraordinary. They were trained to handle impossible situations. Rachel Thompson survived things that would have broken most people. She might be the best person to help solve this problem, if you give her the chance. The decision was made to attempt contact with Sarah Mitchell. Admiral Chun would travel to Portland immediately, accompanied by Dr. Warren, who was the person most likely to be trusted by someone who had spent 16 years believing she was completely alone with her secrets. But first, they needed to address the immediate legal crisis. FBI Director Morrison contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland and arranged for an emergency meeting with the prosecutor handling the case. The meeting would be classified, and the prosecutor would be told only that national security concerns required a delay in proceedings. It was a temporary solution, but it would buy them time. Meanwhile, a team of security specialists began assessing the locations and situations of the other 11 former Shadow Rose operatives. If this situation couldn't be contained, if the program was exposed, They needed to be prepared to protect women who had been living normal lives for over a decade. Admiral Chun and Dr. Warren boarded a military aircraft at 0530 hours for the flight to Portland. During the 3-hour journey, Dr. Warren briefed Admiral Chun on Rachel Thompson's psychological profile and what they could expect when they revealed the truth about why she had been arrested. She's been trained to expect betrayal, Dr. Warren explained. One of the hardest parts of deep cover work is that you can't trust anyone completely. When we gave her a new identity, when we told her she could never acknowledge her real service, we were asking her to live with a fundamental isolation that most people can't imagine. She's been alone with these secrets for 16 years. Admiral Chun studied the psychological evaluations from Rachel's extraction and recovery period. The reports described someone who had been deeply traumatized but who had maintained her psychological integrity even under extreme duress. She had been diagnosed with complex PTSD, but she had also shown remarkable resilience and adaptation to civilian life under her new identity. What do you think her reaction will be when we tell her we know who she really is? Admiral Chun asked. Dr. Warren considered the question carefully. I think she'll be relieved. Living with that level of secrecy, never being able to acknowledge your real accomplishments, never being able to honor your fallen comrades or share your experiences, it's a form of psychological torture in itself. Being able to tell the truth to people who understand what she went through, it might be the best thing that's happened to her in 16 years. The aircraft landed at Portland International Airport at 0830 hours. Admiral Chun and Dr. Warren were met by a team from the FBI's Portland field office, led by Agent Patricia Reeves, the same agent who had arrested Sarah Mitchell 3 days earlier. Agent Reeves had been briefed on the classified nature of the situation, but she still didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. I need you to understand, Admiral Chun told Agent Reeves as they drove toward the federal holding facility, that the woman you arrested has served her country in ways that exceed anything you've probably seen in your career. She's not a criminal. She's a hero who got caught in an impossible situation. At 0900 hours, while Sarah Mitchell should have been appearing in federal court, Admiral Chun and Dr. Warren were instead walking through the corridors of the federal holding facility, about to have a conversation that would change everything. Sarah Mitchell was sitting in the interview room when they entered, still wearing the orange jumpsuit of a federal detainee. She looked up as they walked in, and Admiral Chun saw immediately what Dr. Warren had meant about her maintaining her psychological integrity. Despite 3 days in federal custody, despite being arrested for crimes she hadn't committed, Sarah's posture and expression showed the quiet confidence of someone who had survived far worse situations. Her reaction when she saw Dr. Warren was immediate recognition followed by a complex mixture of emotions that played across her face in rapid succession: shock, confusion, fear, and, finally, something that looked like hope. "Hello, Rachel," Dr. Warren said quietly. "I think it's time we talked about what really happened to you, and what we're going to do to fix this." Sarah Mitchell, for the first time in 16 years, heard someone use her real name. The conversation that followed would determine not just her fate, but the fate of 11 other women and the security of operations that were still protecting American lives around the world. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone involved was about to discover whether secrets that had been kept for 2 decades could finally be safely revealed. The silence in the interview room stretched for nearly a minute after Dr. Warren spoke Rachel Thompson's real name. Sarah Mitchell, who had been living with carefully buried memories and enforced secrecy for 16 years, stared at the woman who had been her psychological anchor during the darkest period of her life. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of isolation and carefully controlled emotion. "I wondered if this day would ever come," she said quietly. "I wondered if anyone still remembered who I really was." Admiral Chun introduced himself and explained his role in the investigation that had led to this moment. As he spoke, he watched Sarah's expression carefully, looking for signs of the psychological fragility that Dr. Warren had warned him about. Instead, he saw someone who was processing information with the tactical awareness of a trained operative. "You know about Shadow Rose," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question. You know what we did." "We know everything," Dr. Warren replied. "We know about your training, your deployments, what happened to you in 2007, and why you were given a new identity. We also know that your arrest for stolen valor is the most ironic injustice we've ever seen." Sarah laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Stolen valor. I've been accused of stealing honors from myself. Do you understand how that feels? To be arrested for claiming service that I actually performed, by people who have no idea what that service cost me. Admiral Chen leaned forward. We understand more than you might think. We also understand that we have a serious problem. Your case is scheduled to go to trial. And if that happens, if your defense attorney starts demanding access to military records to prove your innocence, we could end up exposing Operation Nightfall and Shadow Rose. That could compromise 11 other women who are living quiet lives just like you were. The mention of her former teammates changed Sarah's expression immediately. The others? Are they safe? Are they all accounted for? Dr. Warren nodded. They're all living normal lives under their assigned identities. None of them have been compromised yet. But if this case exposes the program, that could change very quickly. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, and Admiral Chun could see her processing the implications with the strategic thinking that had made her successful as an operative. When she spoke again, her voice had the focused clarity of someone making tactical decisions under pressure. What do you need from me? It was exactly the response Dr. Warren had predicted. After 16 years of enforced silence, Rachel Thompson was finally being given the opportunity to serve her country again, to protect the women who had served alongside her, and to resolve a situation that threatened everything they had sacrificed to protect. Admiral Chin outlined the complexity of the situation. The arrests had been public, witnesses had given statements, and the prosecutor's office was prepared to pursue federal charges. They couldn't simply make the case disappear without raising questions that could lead to even more dangerous investigations. We need to find a way to resolve this that protects your freedom, protects the other Shadow Rose operatives, and keeps the classified programs from being exposed, Admiral Chin explained. We're hoping you might have insights about how to accomplish that. Sarah stood and began pacing the small interview room, a habit Dr. Warren remembered from their sessions 16 years earlier. It was how Rachel processed complex problems, and it was encouraging to see that the psychological techniques that had helped her survive were still intact. The prosecutor has to prove I never performed the service I'm accused of claiming, Sarah said, thinking aloud. But they can't prove that without investigating military records that will lead them to classified information. So their case is fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Admiral Chin nodded. That's our assessment as well. But the defense attorney will demand access to those same records to prove your innocence. Either way, the investigation leads to classified information. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face them. What if we give them a different story? What if we provide military records that show I did serve, but not in the capacity that's been claimed? Dr. Warren looked puzzled. I'm not sure I follow. My original enlistment and early service records are real, Sarah explained. I did complete Army Ranger training. I did serve in special operations before being recruited for Nightfall. What if we create a plausible service history that explains my knowledge and capabilities without revealing Shadow Rose? Admiral Chin immediately understood what she was proposing. You're suggesting we craft a cover story that's true enough to be believable, but false enough to protect classified information. Exactly. We create records showing that Rachel Thompson served in Army Special Operations in a support role that involved training with various Special Forces units, including Navy SEALs. It would explain my knowledge of procedures and capabilities without revealing the classified operations. The records would show honorable service that got exaggerated by civilians who didn't understand the difference between training with SEALs and being a SEAL. It was an elegant solution that could satisfy the legal requirements while protecting classified information. The government could modify their charges to reflect false claims about the nature of her service rather than the existence of her service. Sarah would plead guilty to a lesser charge related to allowing misconceptions to persist rather than actively claiming honors she hadn't earned. Dr. Warren raised a crucial concern. Rachel, this solution would require you to continue living with a modified version of the lie you've been living for 16 years. You still wouldn't be able to claim your real honors, acknowledge your real service, or tell your real story. Are you prepared for that? Sarah's answer came without hesitation. I've been prepared for that since the day you told me that Rachel Thompson had died in a training accident. The difference now is that I know someone remembers what really happened. That's more than I've had for 16 years. Admiral Chun felt a deep respect for the woman sitting across from him. She was willing to sacrifice recognition of her extraordinary service for a second time in order to protect her former teammates and classified operations that were still serving the national interest. There's something else we need to discuss, Admiral Chin said. This situation has shown us that the isolation we imposed on you and the other Shadow Rose operatives might not be sustainable indefinitely. We're considering whether there's a way to provide ongoing support without compromising security. Sarah looked skeptical. What kind of support? Dr. Warren leaned forward. Medical support for service-connected injuries and trauma, for one thing. Mental health resources from people who understand what you went through. Maybe even periodic contact with other program veterans, under carefully controlled circumstances. The possibility of connection with others who understood her experience was something Sarah had never dared to hope for. You're talking about acknowledging that we exist, even if you can't acknowledge what we did. We're talking about recognizing that the isolation we imposed as a security measure might have become a form of punishment for people who had already sacrificed everything, Admiral Chen replied. This situation has forced us to re-examine some assumptions about how we treat people who serve in the most classified operations. The conversation continued for 2 hours as they worked out the details of a solution that could satisfy legal requirements while protecting national security interests. Sarah's insights into the psychology of the witnesses and the dynamics of the case proved invaluable. She understood better than anyone how misconceptions had led to her arrest, and she was uniquely positioned to help craft a resolution. The plan they developed was complex but achievable. The government would modify the charges to reflect exaggeration of actual military service rather than complete fabrication. Sarah would plead guilty to a misdemeanor charge related to failing to correct misconceptions about the nature of her service. She would receive a sentence of community service and probation, allowing her to maintain her freedom while acknowledging legal wrongdoing. Most importantly, the military would create a new program to provide support for veterans of the most classified operations. It would be carefully structured to provide medical, psychological, and social support without revealing operational details. Other Shadow Rose veterans would be contacted and offered participation in the program. Dr. Warren would oversee the psychological aspects of the program, ensuring that people who had been forced into isolation for national security reasons weren't abandoned by the country they had served. It wouldn't fully compensate for the sacrifices they had made, but it would acknowledge that their service and their ongoing well-being mattered. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Chen asked Sarah one final question. Do you regret your service? Given everything that happened, everything you've lost, do you wish you had made different choices? Sarah's answer came without hesitation. Never. What we did mattered. Lives were saved, attacks were prevented, intelligence was gathered that shaped policy decisions that protected American interests. The fact that we can never be publicly thanked for it doesn't change the value of what we accomplished. She paused and looked directly at Admiral Chen. But I'm grateful that someone finally knows the truth. I'm grateful that my teammates, and I won't be forgotten, even if we can never be openly honored. That's more recognition than I expected to have in my lifetime. Dr. Warren reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. You were never forgotten, Rachel. Not by me, not by the people who knew what you did, and not by the country you served. We just needed to find a way to let you know that without compromising everything you helped protect. Admiral Chen and Dr. Warren left the interview room with a solution that could resolve the immediate crisis while addressing the larger issues that the case had revealed. The legal proceedings would be concluded with a plea agreement that satisfied justice without exposing classified information. Sarah Mitchell would be free to continue her life in Portland, but she would no longer be completely alone with her secrets. The 11 other Shadow Rose operatives would be contacted by people who knew their real stories and offered support that acknowledged their service without revealing it. A small but significant step toward correcting an injustice that had lasted for 16 years. Most importantly, the precedent would be established for how to handle similar situations in the future. The lesson learned was that people who serve in the most classified operations deserve to be supported and remembered, even when their service can never be publicly acknowledged. Sarah Mitchell would walk out of the federal holding facility the next day, free to continue the life she had built for herself. But now she would carry that life with the knowledge that her real service was remembered, valued, and honored by people who understood what it had cost her. The woman who had once been Rachel Thompson, who had served her country in ways that exceeded any official military training, who had sacrificed everything including her own identity for national security, was finally receiving the recognition she had earned. It wasn't the public acknowledgement that other veterans received, but it was something far more valuable, the knowledge that her service mattered and that she wasn't forgotten. The case that had begun with an arrest for stolen valor was concluding with the restoration of a hero's place in the hidden history of American special operations. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was justice nonetheless. 6 months after her arrest, Sarah Mitchell stood in the same Portland courtroom where her legal ordeal had begun. But everything had changed since that chaotic day when she had been accused of stolen valor. Today, she was concluding her community service requirement, and the federal prosecutor was formally requesting that all remaining conditions of her probation be terminated early due to her exceptional compliance with the court's requirements. The plea agreement had been carefully crafted to satisfy legal requirements while protecting classified information. Sarah had pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of failure to correct public misconceptions regarding military service. The charge acknowledged that she had allowed others to believe details about her service that were inaccurate, without requiring the court to determine what her actual service had been. Her sentence had included 200 hours of community service, which she had completed by working with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to homeless veterans. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved that she was helping veterans while being unable to acknowledge her own service, but Sarah had thrown herself into the work with a dedication that impressed everyone who worked with her. Federal public defender Michael Rodriguez, who had initially been prepared to fight the charges vigorously, had been privately briefed on the national security aspects of the case. While he couldn't be told the specific details of Sarah's actual service, he was informed that pursuing a defense based on demanding access to military records could compromise ongoing operations and put lives at risk. The plea agreement had been the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Judge Margaret Foster, who was presiding over the case, had been given a classified briefing about the general nature of the security concerns, though she hadn't been told the specific details of Shadow Rose. She understood that this case involved complexities that went far beyond typical stolen valor prosecution, and she had worked to ensure that justice was served while protecting information that remained vital to national security. As the formal proceedings concluded, Sarah walked out of the courthouse as a free woman with no remaining legal obligations. But, more importantly, she walked out knowing that her real story was finally known by people who understood its significance. The changes in her life had begun immediately after her meeting with Admiral Chun and Dr. Warren. Within a week of that conversation, she had been contacted by Dr. Jennifer Hayes, a Navy psychologist who specialized in working with veterans of classified operations. Dr. Hayes had become Sarah's therapist, providing professional support from someone who understood the unique psychological challenges faced by people who had served in operations that could never be publicly acknowledged. The therapy had been transformative. For 16 years, Sarah had carried the burden of her memories alone, unable to share her experiences with anyone who could understand their significance. Working with Dr. Hayes, she had been able to process trauma that had been buried for years, address survivor guilt that she had never been able to discuss, and develop coping strategies for the ongoing challenges of living with classified memories. Most remarkably, Dr. Hayes had been authorized to facilitate limited contact between Sarah and 3 other former Shadow Rose operatives who had volunteered to participate in the support program. The contacts were carefully managed to protect security, but they represented the first time in 16 years that Sarah had been able to talk with people who truly understood what she had experienced. The first conversation had been with Maria Santos, who had been Rose 3, and who was now living in Austin, Texas, under the identity of Maria Rodriguez, working as a high school Spanish teacher. The call had lasted 3 hours, with both women crying as they shared memories of missions, fallen comrades, and the extraordinary challenges they had overcome together. "I thought I was the only one still alive," Maria had said during that first conversation. "I thought everyone else had died or disappeared. Being able to talk to you, knowing that others remember what we did, it's like getting a piece of my soul back." Similar conversations with Jennifer Walsh, formerly Rose 9, now a nurse in Florida, and Catherine Moore, formerly Rose 11, now a small business owner in Colorado, had created a support network that none of them had dared to hope for. They shared updates on their lives, memories of their shared service, and, most importantly, validation that their experiences had been real and significant. The psychological impact had been profound. Dr. Hayes documented significant improvements in Sarah's mental health indicators within months of beginning the program. The isolation and disconnection that had characterized her life in Portland began to give way to a sense of purpose and connection that she hadn't felt since her extraction from Shadow Rose. Admiral Chun had kept his promise about creating ongoing support for classified operations veterans. The program, officially designated as Special Access Support Initiative, had been authorized by the Secretary of Defense and provided medical, psychological, and social support for veterans whose service remained classified. It was carefully structured to provide assistance without revealing operational details, but it acknowledged that people who had served in the most secret operations deserved recognition and care from their country. The program had quietly contacted all surviving Shadow Rose operatives, as well as other veterans of deeply classified operations from various programs. Not all had chosen to participate, some preferring to maintain their anonymity, but enough had joined to create a small but meaningful support community for people who had shared extraordinary experiences. Dr. Warren, who had come out of retirement to oversee the program's psychological services, found the work deeply rewarding. These people sacrificed everything for their country, including recognition and support, she explained to Admiral Chun during one of their regular briefings. The least we can do is ensure they're not abandoned. The program had also created a secure archive for the personal accounts and memories of classified operations veterans. Participants could record their experiences in detail, knowing that their stories would be preserved even if they could never be made public. It wasn't the same as public recognition, but it ensured that their service would be remembered by future generations of military leadership. Sarah had contributed extensively to the archive, recording detailed accounts of Shadow Rose operations, training procedures, and the extraordinary capabilities of her teammates. The recordings had already provided valuable insights for current special operations planners, proving that the women's service continued to benefit national security even decades later. The media attention surrounding Sarah's case had eventually faded, as such stories typically do. Local news outlets had reported on the conclusion of her case with brief mentions of the plea agreement, but without understanding the real story behind the headlines. The public remained unaware that one of the most significant stolen valor cases in recent memory had actually involved genuine military heroism that could never be acknowledged. Marcus Webb, the young journalist whose assumptions had started the entire crisis, had struggled with guilt about his role in Sarah's arrest. He had attempted to apologize to her several times, but Sarah had declined to meet with him. Through her attorney, she had sent him a message: "You weren't wrong to be concerned about stolen valor. Real veterans deserve to have their service protected from those who would falsely claim it. You just happened to encounter a situation that was more complicated than anyone could have imagined." Marcus had eventually written an article about the experience, focusing on the importance of verifying claims before acting on assumptions. He had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between responsible journalism and speculation, and his work had become more careful and thorough as a result. Agent Patricia Reeves, who had arrested Sarah, had been profoundly affected by learning about the real circumstances of the case. While she couldn't be told specific details about Shadow Rose, she had been briefed enough to understand that she had arrested someone who had genuinely served their country in extraordinary ways. She had requested a transfer to the FBI's Veterans Affairs Liaison Office, where she now worked to ensure that veterans received appropriate support, and that cases involving military service were handled with proper understanding of their complexity. For Sarah personally, the resolution of her case had marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She continued to work as a security consultant in Portland, but now she did so with a renewed sense of purpose and connection. She had begun teaching self-defense classes to women, drawing on her extraordinary training to help others develop confidence and skills. She couldn't tell her students about her background, but she could share knowledge that had been acquired through some of the most demanding training ever conducted. More importantly, she had begun to heal from trauma that had been compounded by years of isolation. The knowledge that her service was remembered and valued, that her teammates were alive and thriving, that her country had not forgotten the sacrifices she had made, had transformed her understanding of her own life and experiences. On the one-year anniversary of her arrest, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a medal she had never seen before, accompanied by a letter signed by the Secretary of Defense. The medal was simple but elegant, bearing only a date range that encompassed her years of service and an inscription that read, "For service beyond recognition." The letter was brief but meaningful. The nation's gratitude cannot always be publicly expressed, but it is never absent. Your service protected American lives and interests in ways that will always matter, even if they cannot always be acknowledged. You and your teammates represent the finest traditions of military service, and your sacrifices have not been forgotten. Sarah held the medal for a long time, thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. From Rachel Thompson, the young woman who had volunteered for the most demanding training imaginable, To Sarah Mitchell, the woman who had been arrested for claiming honors she had actually earned, to this moment of quiet recognition for service that would always remain classified. The medal couldn't be displayed publicly. Her service could never be fully acknowledged. Her teammates would always remain hidden behind assumed identities. But they had not been forgotten, and that knowledge had made all the difference. Sarah placed the medal in a secure location with other mementos from her real life as Rachel Thompson. Then, she returned to her work, her community service, and her new relationships with the few people who knew her real story. She was still living under an assumed identity, still carrying classified memories, still unable to claim public recognition for extraordinary service. But she was no longer alone with her secrets. She was part of a community of people who had served their country in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged but would always be remembered by those who mattered. She had finally received the recognition she had earned, even if it had to remain forever hidden from the world. The woman who had been arrested for impersonating a female SEAL had proven that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds a way to surface. Her story had exposed the existence of America's most classified female operatives and had led to the creation of support systems for veterans whose service had demanded the ultimate sacrifice, their own identities. It wasn't the ending that Rachel Thompson had imagined when she first volunteered for Shadow Rose. But it was an ending that honored her service while protecting the secrets that service had been designed to guard. In the world of classified operations, it was the best possible resolution. Justice served, truth acknowledged, and heroes finally, quietly, recognized. Sarah Mitchell continued her life in Portland, but now she carried with her the knowledge that some stories, even when they can never be told, are never truly forgotten. Her arrest for stolen valor had become the key that unlocked recognition for herself and 11 other women whose extraordinary service would always remain America's best-kept secret. The tattoo that had started it all remained hidden beneath her clothing, but now it served as a badge of honor rather than a burden of secrecy. It was proof of service that could never be public, recognition that could never be displayed, and memories that could never be shared. But it was also evidence of sacrifice that would never be forgotten by the people who understood what it represented. In the end, that was enough.